Hello everyone! So my name is Lily and I'm the book blogger behind Utopia State of Mind, and today I want to share with you my most disappointing reads of 2020. So grab a cup of tea because I'm going to be spilling the tea for all of you today. One quick disclaimer I want to make before I delve into this video is that all of my opinions are my own opinions, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't, if you like some of these books, that's entirely your right to like them, and I totally respect that. Some of these are just things that I wasn't expecting. Some of these were just things, elements or things in the books that didn't really jive with me, or that I didn't really expect, or that didn't resonate with me in the way I wanted it to. So I definitely want to say that, before we start, everyone's opinion is their own opinion, and I'm trying to be as objective and describe to you exactly why I didn't like it as much. And if you want to know further reasons why I didn't like it, definitely check out the full reviews of the books on my blog, because I'm able to delve into more of why I didn't like it. And also, for this, I didn't reread all of those past reviews. I'm only basing it on what can I specifically remember that I didn't enjoy or that disappointed me when I read it. I hope that the feedback to this video is not as extreme as I anticipate it to be, because some of these books are pretty hyped or from kind of well-beloved authors. So, let's get into this. So the first book I want to talk about is Every Reason We Shouldn't, and I'm a little bit salty about this book for a few different reasons. So for the first reason, I've been looking for a figure skating book forever. I grew up really enjoying watching the Cutting Edge movie, and so I've been looking for a book, actually YA adult, any book really, that has figure skating. And when I saw Every Reason We Shouldn't, I was like, yes, figure skating for me. And then I also saw that it was with a biracial Japanese American main character, and I was even more excited to see Asian representation in that book. And also, when I was looking at the name of the author as well, I was like, oh, the author looks like they have a Japanese last name, so that's also encouraging to me. And then I started reading it. And, I started reading it. I had mixed feelings about the book in general. I was kind of like, oh, not even on a representation aspect, which I'll get into in a second, but just kind of I was thinking, there are some things with the relationship with her mom that I would love to be explored a little bit more, because her mom has chronic pain, and I thought that was interesting to see in a side character, is to delve into that relationship, because I also don't see that often in a lot of the YA books I'm reading. And then it just really was never explored or never discussed in a depth that to me made it seem like the character was dealing with that. It was something that was in her life, but it never really felt like something that was explored in relation to her mom. More like it was a character trait of hers to have her mom be struggling with chronic pain, but it didn't really ever seem like something that she and her mom were kind of discussing, I guess, if that makes sense. Anyway, I don't suffer from chronic pain myself, and I don't have a family member who's currently going under treatment for chronic pain, so I couldn't speak to that accuracy of the representation. But just from my perspective, it just felt a little bit underdeveloped. And then I was thinking about the representation, and for me, the representation was pretty shallow. It was just talking about the ways in which she was biracial and the ways that affected it, but it seemed a little bit stereotypical, and it also seemed just shallow in general. And I'm not saying that this book had to be entirely about her identity, but the ways that it was brought into the text felt shallow, is kind of the word I want to describe that. And then I was doing a little bit more research, because then I was going to write my review. And kind of struggling to say what I wanted to say, and I was doing more research into the author, and then I realized the author actually is not Asian. The author ended up marrying, I think, an Asian, her partner is Asian, and so she took the partner's last name. And I was reading this because in the author's note at the end, she talks about how she wrote representation that she wanted her biracial children to read, right? So it was her children are, I think, biracial according to the author's note. But it just, I felt a little bit tricked because it seemed to me all of these things to say that it was own voices, and it wasn't own voices. And of course, I was looking at it and I didn't see any like tag for it. So I wasn't, it was just more, I felt a little bit misled, and then even more misled after reading the author's note, and especially also considering the fact that the representation felt, yeah, just shallow. And in the author's note, I also didn't see anything about sensitivity reads or any of those kinds of things like that as well. So in general, that was pretty disappointing because I had really high hopes for that book, and it let me down really big. And I do need more ice skating recommendations, so please let me know down below if you know any books with ice skating. I know basically this one and that's it, so it makes this even more disappointing. So maybe this whole disappointing book should be paired with books that I would recommend. Another Japanese American book that I really enjoyed was I Love You So Mochi. I've recommended this so many times now. I read it and I'm an instant fan, and so that one I would definitely recommend if that's kind of also a vibe you're searching for. Okay, the next book I also want to talk about and take a big gulp of tea because it is the first Sarah J Maas book I've ever read. Okay, I haven't read any of the A Court of Blahs and Blahs or the other series that Maas writes about. I don't know. I think there are 2 series. I don't really know. This is my first Sarah J Maas book, and it was so hyped, right? So everybody lost their cool over this book. So it's House of Earth and Blood, which, okay, I think we can all agree that it probably should have been called Crescent City, considering how big Crescent City is written and how I just kept calling it Crescent City until I googled that on Goodreads and I was like, nothing's coming up really. So I mean, that already was kind of just like not a huge fan of that. It was kind of confusing. But also B, this was so hyped to me, and considering how Maas's other works have been kind of fantasy worlds that have not been in our world, I was expecting like a fantasy world that was completely different, right? Something that was, yeah, just completely different. And for me, House of Earth and Blood, I gotta check that, yes, House of Earth and Blood was more of like an urban fantasy, which is not a bad thing. I love urban fantasies. When I was a teen, I grew up reading paranormal urban fantasies, like no joke. I have so many books at my house which were that genre, but for me it was hyped up so hard about being like really unique, and the world building and just like the characters and just everything. And so I guess a common theme for this list of disappointing reads will be a lot of them were super hyped, and when you have super hyped books, sometimes they just don't land as well for other people. And that was the case for me with a lot of books, and certainly the case with me for House of Earth and Blood. So you may ask why I didn't like it. So I also felt a little bit like this was a bait and switch. I was expecting, as I said, something very high fantasy, and it ended up being more urban fantasy. Not mad about it, but I was kind of just like, huh? And then I also felt like House of Earth and Blood, A, was a bit too long, and B, because it was a bit too long, but the pacing for the beginning parts were really slow to me, and I mean I stuck through it because I read this with a book club of mine, but it was just kind of something where I was like, well, I see things happening, I just wonder like when the thing is gonna happen, right? There was enough action to keep me going, but there were just bits in between that were not really as relevant as I felt. And what ends up happening is that it ends up being more of kind of a mystery detective whodunit kind of thing, which I also really enjoy. But it does mean that there are certain elements that we're delving into either areas where it was like, oh, let's talk about the fantasy world, or oh, let's talk about the, you know, detective-y case thing. And so when I kept switching, I was kind of just like, well, this is interesting. It's kind of long. So I don't know where this is going. So that was another element why it wasn't really necessarily my cup of tea. And also, I just felt that considering the hype, a lot of the characters just felt a little bit tropey. So they just felt like they were going too much into all of the urban fantasy tropes that I had read when I was a teen, right? So we have this alpha male, we have this like emotionally guarded main character who is like doesn't want to be attracted to an alpha male kind of character, but then somehow is. And so, as I said, it's nothing bad because I love reading tropes, and as I said, I've read a ton of those tropes and like the paranormal urban fantasy, so that also wasn't like a deal breaker for me. But I guess I was just, yeah, I was disappointed. I was expecting something where I was kind of like, wow, this world is so great. Kind of like how I felt with Black Sun, and kind of how I felt with The City We Became. Like all of these different fantasy worlds which felt so real. And also, for example, The City We Became, right? That is an urban fantasy set in New York City, and it still felt like the magic system came alive and the world and the magic like worked in tandem. And also for House of Earth and Blood, there are a lot of world building questions that I don't know about. Like, I'm very confused still. I also saw like merch and stuff for this book where I was kind of like, yeah, I understand these different parts of the cities and all of these different houses and whatever, but I don't get it and I don't understand them. So yeah, the hype train let me down, and I'd like to exit the train now, please. The next book is The Guinevere Deception. Whew. So I love King Arthur / Guinevere retellings. They're one of my favorite things to read. I unfortunately end up being more disappointed than not. And I had really high hopes for Guinevere Deception because I'd heard a lot about Kirsten White's books. I actually have only read The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein, which I really enjoyed, but I haven't read any of Kirsten White's other series, right? So there are other series that I actually don't even know the name of, but there are other series. I hadn't read them, so I heard just a lot of hype about this author in general. And of course, there's the King Arthur element. But, I felt that she was really passive, and I felt that she was more passive than I thought it was going to be. So when I think that King Arthur can go a lot of different ways, especially in the adaptation sense that we see over and over again. And I just felt like she was just letting Arthur dictate a lot of her decisions and letting Arthur like tell her more about what she could and couldn't do and where she could and couldn't go. And it wasn't even like oh, you're telling me where I can't go, so now I'm gonna do exactly the opposite and ha ha ha, or like that. It just felt more, just more passive, and it was also super slow paced. I was kind of like, what is going on? And I think I've basically read 75% of the book, and then in the last 25%, I was like, oh yeah, I see where the action is going. I get it. But 75% of the book, that is more than half. That is the majority of the book at that point. And so I was kind of like, I actually don't also think I'll read the sequel, by the way. Some of these disappointing reads, I will read the sequel still, but I won't, probably. And also, I think it's difficult. I talked about this in a few different reviews, and I think it's difficult because when you have a character that's hiding things from themselves or doesn't know that they're hiding things from themselves, so you might see this when it like in one of those things where maybe they've been cursed, their memories have been lost, like all of these different tropes or elements that you've heard of. I'm sure you can list a bunch of different ones as well. I was just reading one the other day where like someone had lost their memories and didn't know that they'd lost their memories. So it's not really like that specifically, because I also cannot remember the conditions about this book. But it had also that thing where like if characters are hiding things even from themselves, or they don't know they're hiding things from themselves, they can come off as really distant to me, and also to readers, I think, in general, because we're not really sure, A, what their motivations are, and also, like, why are they acting like this, and they don't even know, which is, unfortunate for them. I feel bad for them. They should, invest in some therapy, but it just makes it harder to connect with them, and it makes it harder to understand what is going on, maybe, or understand at least what the characters are doing and why they're doing what they're doing. So for me, was not a fan of a Guinevere Deception, and was pretty disappointing. But I will say, a King Arthur-esque retelling that is super great and definitely lived up to the hype for me was definitely Legendborn. Okay, the next book I want to talk about is A Neon Darkness. This is a sequel, prequel book to The Infinite Noise, which I enjoyed. I've not listened to the podcast thing, so I'm definitely not the biggest fan in that sense. Like, that's not where I came from when I was reading this book, but I enjoyed it. I love the idea of superpowered teens, and also superpowered teens kind of trying to figure out how to live their high school lives and in like a more realistic way than I think we see a lot of portrayals in comic books and like books in general and movies and TV, like in a more realistic way than all of that kind of stuff. But I think I ended up giving it maybe like between a 3 and a 4. So I liked it, but it wasn't something where I was like super, super obsessed. But I did want to read this prequel slash sequel. So it's a sequel in the sense that it comes out after The Infinite Noise, but I think it's actually a prequel story to The Infinite Noise, which I would know if I was A, a big fan, or B, also someone who did more research in general. But for me, okay, I try not to let my personal opinions about a character or my personal mental space at that time really affect my rating of a book. Even though it will affect my enjoyment of a book, I try to keep a little bit of objectivity to think of, okay, maybe if I don't like this character, or maybe if I'm not in the right headspace to be reading this book, how would I feel? How do objectively I feel about character writing, character development, characterization in general, like, objectively, how do I feel? It was really hard for me to stay objective in A Neon Darkness, because the main character in A Neon Darkness is just, he's just such a typical white privileged man, like a white privileged boy, essentially. So his superpower is like, he gets what he wants, essentially, and there are different, flaws and different details to that power, which I don't really remember, but that's the basic gist. So basically, like, if I want you to give me whatever, let's just say your special edition of the Poppy War series, then you'll want to give it to me, and you won't know that you don't want to. Like, that's the power. You will think you want to, and it will be organic, and for a lot of people, you won't really understand that that's happening. I don't know, like, the rules of this world or the rules of that magic, so I don't know if everyone will realize, or only other people maybe who have powers will realize. I have no idea. I don't remember. But so for me, it was just like, so you get everything you want, you are a white dude, and that makes your life hard. So that must suck for you. And like, okay, I realize that that's being pretty salty, okay, but, and it does, in the book, does delve into the fact, like, oh, how much am I willing to do for my power? How much can I separate my power from my identity? And how much do I let that specific power affect my relationships and my friendships and basically every relationship I have with anyone? Because how do I know how they feel? How do they know how they feel? Etc., right? So there was delving into it for me, but I just also read this like around the summertime when all of the world was going through all of the Black Lives Matter protest movements, and I was just kind of like, so this is not a book that I have the patience for this dude at this moment, and I don't know now if I'll ever have the patience for this dude. So yeah, it was really hard for me to stay objective on that one. I don't know really how else to describe. That was just disappointing because I was expecting something similar, I guess, to The Infinite Noise. Oh, well, actually, one of the lines I was thinking about for this book is like, what if you don't realize that you are the villain of this story? So I think that kind of question really sums up the infinite... Oh, why do I keep saying The Infinite Noise? It really sums up A Neon Darkness, but I was also kind of just like, well, this is clearly not a book that is for me at this point in time. So now that I think about sort of what would be a book I would recommend instead of A Neon Darkness, I really like the Not Your Sidekick, Not Your Backup, Not Your Villain superhero series by C.B. Lee. Those are really great superhero series, also kind of delving into normal lives and, you know, internships and friendships and relationships that are also not as obnoxious to me. And the next book I also want to talk about is Our Dark Duet. I was buddy reading this with Hannah. It's going to be a huge arm workout to hold out my tea and this book. But for me, so in this Savage Song, I really enjoyed Kate's character, but I didn't really feel like I ever really got to know Kate. And then I was like, oh, maybe in Our Dark Duet we'll delve more into Kate and I'll feel more like I know Kate as a person. And is not the case. That's not how I feel. So I guess it was sad because I always felt like I wanted to know more. And in general, I feel like in Our Dark Duet, a lot of things maybe that were discussed specifically at the beginning and then were they ever wrapped up? I don't really feel like they were. There were a lot of really cool things at the beginning where I was like, oh yeah, this is super cool. I hope that this, you know, gets delved into deeper. And the answer is no. So that was disappointing because in general, I've loved the idea of the world building in this Savage Song and Our Dark Duet. Like the idea of monsters, our actions making monsters, or monstrous actions making monsters. And are you a monster? Are they a monster? Like where is the line of monstrosity? That is a huge, huge favorite theme of mine in general. So I was kind of disappointed. And this was my first read of it, and I don't know, I just felt like the thematic things I wanted in it were discussed, but like it was lacking on resolution for me, really. And I also felt like the end was super rushed, and so in general, I guess I was waiting for this kind of like emotional and satisfying payoff, and I just never really felt like I got it. And I don't know if that's like a me thing, but it's certainly how I feel. So it's disappointing to me because I was really hopeful at the end of this Savage Song, and then while I enjoyed some of the elements and also some of the action and the plot and ending, you know, while I enjoyed some of those elements, it just was not overall delivering to me what I wanted from the sequel or this book in general. So I guess a book that I would recommend instead of A Dark Duet, and that it's tricky because it's a duology, so it's like a duology I'd recommend, because I want to keep it like all kind of duology-esque, everything as similar as I can. What I guess I would recommend is maybe the Never Tilting World and the Ever Cruel Kingdom duology. And there are a lot of differences, right? So they're both fantasy. There's a lot of differences because I think in general, this Savage Song is more an urban fantasy book, and I think that the Never Tilting World is definitely very far removed from that fantasy-wise. But I think that that series developed the themes that I wanted from the first book into the second book in a much more satisfying way to me than this Savage Song duology, or I think the actual name of the series is The Monsters of Verity. And I definitely think that we get a better sense of the characters as they evolve. So basically all of the growth and evolution as a series that I don't really feel like I had in this duology, I definitely feel like I have in the Never Tilting World duology. So even though they are very different, I think if you are looking for what I'm kind of talking about, the satisfying payoff of growth and evolution as a whole for characters and worlds and storylines and themes, then I would definitely recommend that duology. So the next book is We Were Restless Things. I had huge hopes for this because a good friend of mine had said that they were starting it and that they really liked it. So I was like, yes, I'm excited. But, okay, this is hard. I was excited for a variety of different reasons, and I was also let down for a variety of different reasons. A, it is gigantic. I was like, when I was going into Goodreads to kind of feel like, could I read this in a reasonable time? Like, how many days should I, you know, allocate for this book? It is massive. I want to say that it's over 500 pages, if not, like, I would say it's between 400 and 600 pages for sure, but I think definitely over 500 pages, and it was just really slow, and it's character driven, a lot of character driven for such a large amount of pages. And I don't dislike character driven stories. Those are also some of my favorite, but like, it was not a satisfying resolution for the characters as well, in my opinion. And it was something where it was so slow that when there were reveals about the action or even the characters, it just felt so anticlimactic. And like, the big reveal was super disappointing. I was just like, what is this? I don't understand. I just was so disappointed. And so it was just really sad because it had ace representation on the page, and going through that, and like, especially also going through that in the sense of struggling to come to terms with that, and also a potential relationship and how it affects both people. And that was really great to read about, and it was definitely kind of like hooking me, right? Because it was something that I'm always looking for a queer representation in YA books, but that wasn't enough to keep it going for me. And considering the length and the lack of resolution in the characters for me, and also like the plot as well, I just was so disappointed, and I felt like I had wasted a lot of my time. And I almost feel like you could just kind of, for me, it would have been a lot happier if you had just kind of if you just kind of deleted the last, I don't know, 100 or even maybe 200 pages, like the last considerable amount of pages, just because I was really displeased with them. So it was really sad because I never felt like the tension went up. For me, the tension like dropped off of a very, very high cliff. So by the way, this is a mug that I won from Lillian Clark for the Immoral Code, which is one of my favorite kind of contemporary heisty type books. It has a great cast of characters, as you'll see on my mug, and is definitely one that I recommend a lot. So definitely not one that belongs in this video. So I just wanted to mention it in case you were wondering about my mug. The book I want to talk about is A Deadly Education. I would definitely read my entire review of that one because there's a lot to get into. So I'm not going to delve too much into the problematic / racist elements of the story, just because a lot of different people have discussed it, and I will leave links below of reviews I thought were really helpful. I had read all those reviews before I started reading Deadly Education, which also is one of those super hyped books. I think Naomi Novik is a super hyped author just because a ton of people love Uprooted and Spinning Silver. So it was definitely hyped, and for me I was kind of like, oh, this is really hyped. I probably should read it. But actually, in all reality, I don't know too much if I would read it on my own if it wasn't hyped. Actually, no. I know I wouldn't read it on my own if it wasn't hyped. So, you know, going into it with that perspective, what can you really expect? But, so, despite the racist specific incidents were about the dreadlock and the leech locks, I think they were called. So, aside from the fact that the main character, Galadriel, is biracial, and I also felt like her identity was super shallowly developed, like, yeah, like a lot. And in a way that was worse than in every recent We Shouldn't, in a way that was very just shallow. And also, where we talk about the fact that a lot of people were discussed for their tokenization, like a lot of the diversity was very much a product of what the main character needs. And I think that one is the most nebulous to kind of discuss because there's a lot about the world building and the system of magic and the school and blah, 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 blah. So aside from all of that, I buddy read this with a few people, and as I said, we'd all kind of read their reviews. So I wouldn't say this was like okay, hate buddy read, I think, is too difficult, or I think that's an unfair description of what it was. It was what is going on? Is this really as bad as everyone says? Buddy read, which is a really long title for the group. So I ended up reading all of this, and yeah, I was not a fan. I know some people who really liked it, and so obviously to each their own. But for me, I just felt like there was a lot of info dumping at the beginning about how the world worked. And also, I mean, I still have lingering questions about how the world works as well that are never developed or never answered. And I think this is a series, so perhaps it will be developed in the future. It just felt drawn out. I just felt like, okay, well, actually, now that I think about it, it felt like, I didn't really empathize with Galadriel, and I didn't really connect with her. And I think a lot of it was because she's pretty prickly, and I really love some prickly heroines and some prickly main characters. I'm all about the prickle. But she was just really hard for me to figure out, like, why you're doing this. Why are you being like this? What is the internal motivation behind it, right? And I don't mind if you're being prickly or if you're being guarded or if you're being even standoffish. But if you have because you have a reason for it. And even if your reason is just like, I like to do this because that's who I am, then that is also a valid reason for you, I suppose. But I didn't really feel like there was a reason. And the reasons that were given also, I was just kind of like, huh? And that was difficult for me. And yeah, I felt like the whole thing was just really drawn out. The whole thing just felt very much like, this is happening, and this is happening, and this is happening, and there just didn't really seem to be too much internal introspection, or too much introspection in general. And you could also argue, I guess, that it's more of like an action-y fantasy book. So, you know, if you're fighting for your life, and if you're scared for your life, you don't have time for internal introspection. I do understand that in general, but I also felt like, I need to know why you're doing what you're doing, and at least a little bit of how you feel about what you're doing. Just because if I wanted to read kind of like an action thing without a lot of that stuff, I probably would just watch a movie or a series, and I probably would not read it. So yeah, I just can't think of any that really are comped, and so that's also kind of disappointing, right? I want more books about magical schools, and I'm just not getting enough that I really like. So definitely please let me know if you have recommendations for that specific category as well, because I'm searching for it. What I would say though, if you want to read about magical schools and training and stuff like that, but training in a much better sense than just what happens in a Deadly Education, then I would say the first Poppy War series has a lot about magical schools and studying stuff. It is definitely a very intense book. Please read the trigger warnings before you read that book, but I definitely think that that is that's a favorite book of mine that has those elements in it as well that I will mention. And then the last two books, I'm gonna try to keep kind of short because I talked about them in my November wrap-up, so my first ever YouTube video about why they were disappointing. So for me, Ninth House had very much a similar vibe to A Deadly Education for me, especially in terms of Alex. I was having a really hard time figuring out what motivated Alex, and I'm a huge fan of the idea that a lot of people who deserve justice don't get justice, and a lot of people who deserve punishment don't get punishment, and how do we kind of search for that outside of the law, maybe? So I'm a fan of that, but I just need to have more of a reason why your actions, or like maybe more of a connection, and I just felt like it was really hard for me to figure out why Alex was doing the things that Alex was doing, or Alex/Galaxy. I would say a lot of the things that were disappointing to me, I mean, besides the fact that this was incredibly hyped as well, was the fact that I have a lot of questions about the world building, and I was buddy reading this with actually a friend who's not really in the book community as well, just an avid reader, and we were both really confused by what was happening and the world building about what was happening. And at the end we were kind of like, well, we don't understand the houses, and also we're not really sure what the 9 of them are, or even what they are, period. Paired with the hype, I was just so disappointed, especially since some people that I know really love this book. And so I guess just for me, it was just not for me, I guess. And the same with this dark academia vibe that you're seeing, or that maybe draws people to Ninth House. I also don't really have a great recommendation for that in general. I'm trying to really delve more into that area of literature because I did enjoy those elements, but at the moment I don't really have any. All I can tell you is that I'm super looking forward to A Lesson in Vengeance by Victoria Lee. I'm just looking forward to it a lot, and I think that it would definitely has these vibes from what I hear, and so I'm really looking forward to that. And then the last disappointing book I want to talk about is The Toll. For me, as I said, I already discussed it in my November wrap up, so what I will say is that for me, what happened for this series was that what drew me to the first two books were this thematic exploration, and I just didn't feel like that was as strong in the third book, which is, you know, all about your expectations of the book when you go into reading it. But the third book read definitely more as an action book, like what's happening next, etc., etc., how are we going to wrap up all these different threads. And so it was definitely entertaining, but it wasn't as thought-provoking as I wanted it to be. And I thought a lot of elements were discussed, but also never really wrapped up in a way. And I just really wanted there to be more of what I was looking for, or what I come to associate with that series. So it was disappointing, but certainly not as disappointing as some of the other books on this list. So I hope that you all enjoyed my most disappointing books of 2020. It is certainly a very salty, perhaps controversial video, which is why I have my tea up here the entire time to give me fuel to chat about all of that stuff. So I will leave the links to the books in the description box below, and all of my social media links where you can find books that I love, and me talking about generally books I love, because that's more what I enjoy doing. And I hope you have a great day, and I will see you later. Bye!